Hi, my name is Malia McAndrew. I research, write, and teach about United States history. And today I'd like to talk to you about voting rights. Now, voting rights are a topic that have been in the news a lot lately. And I think that anytime we want to understand something that's going on in our own society, it's helpful if we look to the past for precedents and patterns that took shape earlier in our nation's history so that we can better contextualize and understand what we're going through today. So I'd like to talk about voting rights in United States history, and I'd like to focus specifically on the 15th Amendment. Now, you might remember the 15th Amendment was the amendment that said that voting rights in the United States could not be abridged on account of things like race. So, to begin our story, I'm going to take us back to the time period that surrounded the Civil War in the United States. And I'd like to start with the story of one man. You might recognize him from this picture here. This is Frederick Douglass. He was among the most prominent American speakers, writers, orators, performers, reformers in all of 19th century United States history. Frederick Douglass was born, though, an ordinary man. He was born in Maryland. But from an early age, he really proved himself to have some exceptional abilities. For example, he taught himself how to read and write. Now, learning how to read and write on your own would be exceptional for any child, but it was especially exceptional for Douglass because Douglass was an enslaved person. And he found himself in a situation where it was actually illegal for many African Americans in the South to learn how to read or write. So he started his interest in learning about things like literature and history in America from a very early age, although he had a difficult go at it his first few decades of life. He was separated from his mother very early in life, and then he was separated from his grandmother. He was expected to labor for a man who was notorious for having, quote unquote, broken other human beings. And at a certain point in his life, Douglass decides to orchestrate his own escape to freedom. He ends up dressing up as a free Black sailor and he escapes to the North. And when he gets to the North, he wants to tell people about the institution of slavery. He wants to tell people not just in the northern states, but people all across the United States and really across the globe. And he wants to speak out against the institution of slavery. And as I said, he was an eloquent orator. He was able to convince people of slavery's wrongs by his own presence, by his own history, by telling his own story. And so he really spoke fiercely and ferociously about the abolition movement in the United States. And I bring up Frederick Douglass because right after the Civil War ended, he said something rather important. He said that slavery in the United States would not be abolished until, quote, the Black man has the ballot. All right. So why did Douglass think this? Why did Douglass think that slavery would never really be over until African American men had the right to vote in the United States? All right. Well, part of the reason for this has to do with the path that the United States was headed down in the years that immediately followed the Civil War. That's a period that historians refer to as Reconstruction. And during Reconstruction, the United States literally had to do things like reconstruct roads, reconstruct bridges, to reconstruct things that had been destroyed by war. But it also meant for people like Douglass, they had to begin reconstructing their families, reconstructing their lives. Maybe a loved one had been sold from one state to another state. Maybe a brother fought against a brother on north and southern lines. And so people had to reconstruct their lives. But people like Douglass also thought that the United States needed to fundamentally reconstruct its political system. They believe that new groups of Americans should be allowed to vote and should be able to participate in the political process. But honestly, they weren't the majority of people at this time. Some people had thought that there had already been enough change, and they simply wanted African Americans in particular to go back to working on plantations, to, yes, be freed laborers, but not to try and participate in the public sphere in any way. right? And actually the president of the United States, President Johnson, who became the president after Lincoln was killed, he was one of these people, that he believed that, hey, if a state wants to discriminate against its white and black citizens, it can go ahead. That's the state's business. It's not up for me, and it's not up for Congress to tell a state how to do its job. So obviously, Douglass doesn't believe this, and there are other people in the United States that don't believe this, and they want to make sure that the Constitution of the United States begins to protect the rights of more and more citizens. And so they start by passing bills in Congress. So for example, the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 starts to lay out for Americans like who a citizen is, what a citizen's rights are. But the things with legislation is that, it can be repealed. The next administration, as the political winds change, a law, it can be repealed more easily than an amendment to the Constitution. And we know amendments to the Constitution can be repealed too. But you need a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, and you need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. And so constitutional amendments to our Constitution have much more sticking power than other things. And in these years of Reconstruction, when the United States was attempting to reconstruct itself, and people like Frederick Douglass wanted the United States to politically reconstruct itself, a number of people put forward amendments to the Constitution, and 3 of them were passed. So you have to see the 15th Amendment as really part of a suite of amendments that were intended to recreate the nation as we know it. And so I'll just name them briefly, and then we'll go into them in more depth. But the Reconstruction amendments were the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. And people often remember them as the amendments that are about freedom, that are about citizenship, and that are about the right to vote. But what I'm going to argue for you here is that these weren't simply just Reconstruction amendments, that some historians would argue that these amendments served as a second founding of the United States. That these didn't just kind of add on to the Constitution, but they fundamentally altered the relationship that Americans have with their government and their government system. All right, so let me go into that a little bit more in depth to start with. And let's compare the Constitution and Bill of Rights from 1787, and let's compare them to the Reconstruction, right? The Reconstruction amendments that happened after the Civil War. So that we know that in the Constitution, basically what it does is it describes the roles and the responsibilities of the US government. Well, the Bill of Rights, it describes the rights and the freedoms that ordinary people like you or I have, the right to assembly, the freedom of the press, the freedom of speech, right? And the Constitution limits the power of the federal government, while the Bill of Rights really gives authority to the people. So you might be familiar with this kind of part of the story already. When the Reconstruction amendments come along, they really change this relationship. They're added on as new amendments to the Constitution, but they change the nature of the federal government and its relationship to the American people. So if you think back to that Constitution and Bill of Rights again, it restricts the powers of the federal government pretty significantly. Like if you just look at the words that are written in these documents, they say things like Congress shall pass no law. As opposed to if you compare that to the Reconstruction amendments, they affirm the powers of the federal government. They give the federal government more powers than it had in its more restricted form before. And instead of saying things like Congress shall pass no law, it says things like Congress shall have the power to do certain things. So it's giving power to the federal state. The framers of the Constitution saw the federal government as a potential threat to liberty. They were really afraid about the potential of abuse that might be there in the federal government. But after the Civil War, those who wanted to reconstruct the United States really took a different approach. They wanted to see the constitutional amendments and the federal government be, as one person of the time period said, custodians of freedom. So no longer a threat to liberty, but the federal government was going to be the thing that ensured people rights. And if there was any state that was doing things that were hurting the liberty of any individual, the Reconstruction Amendments want to give the federal government authority to change things. So for example, in the years after the end of slavery, there are a number of states that say that African Americans can do certain things for the first time. Yes, people have the legal right to marry, but only a person of their own race. And yeah, you have the right to own property, but only if you're a man. But many of the states passed laws in the years after the Civil War that said things like African Americans were not allowed to testify in court, and definitely not allowed to testify in court against whites. In fact, they weren't allowed to serve on juries or in militias, and they definitely were not allowed the right to vote. So what the people who wanted to reconstruct America during the second founding wanted to do was they wanted to give the federal government the power to intercede and intervene should any state be trying to abridge the rights of the citizens of that state. So the framers of the Constitution, if you want to think about it this way, the framers of the Constitution were creating a republic that was very unlike the monarchy that they were attempting to break away from, but they did not envision a society of equals. The framers of the Constitution, they set up a political system in which an electoral college selected the presidents, in which the Senate was elected by the members of state legislatures, and in which a Supreme Court served as justices for life, right? So while we start a republic, the ethos of democracy hasn't quite taken root in the United States. However, as time goes on and as a robust political spirit in the United States to develop, and as people start to debate ideas, the ideals of democracy really seem to seep in and to be tied more and more deeply into Americans' sense of identity. And so what the Reconstruction Amendments try to do is they try to oversee and override any state that wishes to interfere with the most basic rights of American citizens, all right? So if we go back to our friend Frederick Douglass of this time period, I'm going to, a few times in our talk today, I'm going to reference a speech that he gave in Boston called the Composite Nation speech. And in this speech, he says outrightly, you know, it's thought by many and said by some that this republic has already seen its best days, that the historian may now write the story of its decline and fall. So there were people during the period of Reconstruction who were very worried about the direction of the country. They thought that maybe America had seen its best days. And Douglass is not one of those people. In fact, he thinks that there are better days that can come, and that the Reconstruction Amendments, that those like himself who support them think that we're going to be able to come to a nation that is able to build off of the knowledge and the power of more of its people and become a more robust place for that. So if we dig into these amendments a little more, this 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, let's look at exactly what do they say and why do people like Douglass, you know, think that they are going to be able to do something to really protect Americans' individual rights in new ways. Okay, number one, let's start with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment says that slavery and involuntary servitude shall no longer exist in the United States. So the 13th Amendment effectively ends the institution of slavery in the United States, all right? And it also, this amendment, along with many of the others, it gave Congress real teeth. It said that Congress had the authority to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, all right? The 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment is actually like one of the longest amendments of all the amendments that the United States has passed. So I won't list out the whole thing here. Basically, what they did with the 14th is there were like a bunch of competing different amendments, and they kind of like put them all together. It seemed like during this time period of Reconstruction, like every senator had an amendment that he wanted passed. And I think at one point there was even like 75 different amendments that people were debating. So the 14th Amendment is really a mixture of multiple things. But for purposes of our talk, we'll focus just on this section here, where the 14th Amendment is asserting that anyone who is born in the United States or naturalized here is a citizen, all right? So that they have the same rights that citizens have. And again, the 14th Amendment is saying that the federal government has the ability to enforce the law for anybody who would try to abridge the privileges or the immunities of a citizen. So the federal government will look out for individual citizens and making sure that their rights are not being denied. Right? So that's the 14th Amendment. And then the last one, the one that we're really here to focus on today, is the culmination of these Reconstruction amendments, and that is the right to vote. All right. So at the time of this amendment, only 8 northern states allowed their Black citizens the right to vote. So, I mean, I think that that's an important thing to think about. We often think of the South as a place where slavery was happening in the United States. And then people think of, well, the North was a place of freedom. Well, it was more free than the South, but people weren't free to do all of the same things that others were able to do. In fact, in many northern states, the state constitution said that African Americans were not allowed to vote in this place. So what the 15th Amendment does is it clearly says that all citizens have the right to vote, and that right to vote should not be abridged, should not be denied on account of somebody's race, somebody's color, or the fact that they used to be an enslaved person. All right. And again, with the 15th Amendment, Congress writes in some power to this legislation. It says Congress will have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So for instance, let's say there was a state and that state was going to say, hey, we don't want a particular group to be able to vote in this state, then Congress would be able to do something like say, okay, well, if you're not going to allow all of your citizens to vote, then we're not going to give you the same number of delegates who will be in the House of Representatives, right? We'll take away your power in the legislature if you're going to choose to do something like that. So Congress has the power to enforce these Reconstruction amendments. All right, so let's go back to Douglass again. So Douglass, I had told you, he was giving his speech in Boston in 1869. So he was giving his speech really on the eve of the 15th Amendment. And there were those in the United States at this period in time who were a little bit weary of the 15th Amendment, right? And Douglass wanted to kind of assure them that we're going down the right path. And he says, I am to speak to you of the character and mission of the United States, with special reference to the question of whether we are better or worse for being comprised of different races of men. All right. And so again, here's where kind of like the historical context becomes really important, because by this time in United States history, the United States history was not just about Black citizens and white citizens. Obviously, Native Americans were part of the American story. People from Mexico, part of the American story. But also new groups of people started to come to America's shores during this period in time. So the Chinese started to have a number of people come to the United States and come to California around the time of the gold rush. You saw a number of single men contracted to work in things like gold mining, railroads, factories. I mean, a lot of people associate Chinese labor with the building of railroads, and that was certainly significant. But you also had a number of Chinese laborers in low-wage industrial work, making cigars and clothing and shoes. And at the time of Douglass's speech, there started to be more and more families, not just single men, but families migrating from China. And more Americans really saw this group as a threat to the fabric of the United States. So when Douglass was speaking about creating an interracial democracy in the United States, he wasn't just speaking of America in black or white, but Douglass was one of the people who really saw a multicultural America that he thought could arise. And so I'm going to give you a little bit more of this composite nation speech that he gave in Boston in 1969. And if you won't mind, I'm going to read it from you. Let's read it together, but let's read it looking at his actual script. Like, let's look at his actual speech, because I think that in some ways brings us closer to Douglass. I mean, you can see his picture, you can see his handwriting, and I think it might give us a deeper sense of the feeling of the words that he was giving, or at least it does for me. So I'm going to start with the second paragraph and read this second paragraph here. So it starts I, so you can see I have said that the Chinese will come and have given some reasons why we may expect in very large numbers why we may expect them in very large numbers in no very different future. I know it's hard to read the old script. Do you ask if I favor such immigration? I answer, I would. Would you have them naturalized and have them invested with all the rights of American citizenship? I would. Would you allow them to vote? I would. Would you allow them to hold office? I would. So you can see, I mean, it's very clear. Douglass is truly a true egalitarian, and he's speaking out in the United States about not just the rights of African Americans, but he speaks out for the rights of Chinese Americans. He speaks out for the rights of women. I mean, he'd been giving votes on women's suffrage, even 20 years before this speech. So Douglass and the other people who wanted to see a second founding for the United States, they had the goal of reconstructing America in order to create the world's first functioning interracial democracy. All right. Now, as we're going to see, this really remained more of an aspiration than a reality. But I think before we kind of talk about the ways in which their dream of a second founding was not completely fulfilled, I do think that we should spend a little time, and we shouldn't skip over the very progressive effects that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had at the time period that they were instituted, right? And so looking at just the 15th Amendment, if you look at this picture is probably from Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1869. It's just a few years after the end of the Civil War. And what you see in this picture is you see a political rally. You see a band, you see American flags, you see a political sign for a candidate. And you also see white citizens and Black citizens participating together in this political rally out in the middle of broad daylight, just a few years after the end of the Civil War. So, that is something exceptional, that as a result of these amendments, for a good decade, countless individuals were able to exercise citizenship rights and participate in a political process that just years prior had been unthinkable, right? That people literally went from being enslaved to being open participants in a political system in just a few number of years. So I think that's definitely what we could count as a progressive, a positive effect of this. You also saw during this time period, in these years right after the Civil War, 16 African-American men served in Congress. That included 2 men who were senators from Mississippi. So Mississippi had 2 senators who at the same time were men who were African Americans, one of whom had been formerly enslaved, one of whom had been a member of the free Black community in the United States. You see an African American man serve as governor of Louisiana. And you see literally hundreds of people, not just at the federal level, but at the state level, hundreds of African American men serve in state legislatures, right? And then I think even more important than people participating in politics, just as important as people voting, just as important as there being African American leaders in the United States, you also saw that the US Department of Justice during this time period enforced the laws. So that if there was a polling place, and if African Americans were attacked at that polling place, the US Department of Justice showed up and started taking names. It started prosecuting cases. And so, this all goes on in about the 10-year period after these original Reconstruction amendments are put into place, right? So you want to see much of the 1970s, there are major gains in and progressive effects of these amendments. All right, but most of you are also probably a little bit familiar with the fact that there was also a very violent backlash to the 15th Amendment. And many of you might have heard about some of the ways in which that backlash happened, both in law and also through extra legal means. So let me just talk about those very quickly. First, about in law. You see an absolute proliferation of laws during this time period that had the effect of disenfranchising the vast majority of African Americans and other people of color in the United States. These would be things like literacy tests and property qualifications and poll taxes. So if you remember the way that the 15th Amendment was written, it wasn't written as a positive right? It didn't say that everybody just has the right to vote. It says that the right to vote wouldn't be abridged or denied on a case of color or race. So that was a pretty big loophole that some people chose to exploit. So they didn't write in the law, you're being excluded because of your color. They wrote into the law, there's a literacy test. If you want to vote in this state, you have to pass this literacy test, or you have to have a certain amount of property, or you have to pay a certain tax, all right? And so what these laws had the effect of doing is they didn't say race, but they had the effect of disenfranchising thousands and thousands of people. And honestly, the people who framed these laws, many of them didn't care if that also had the effect of disenfranchising poor whites or immigrants as well, all right? So that's happening at the state level. And then also at the federal level, you start to see legislation that was going in the opposite direction of the direction that people like Frederick Douglass wanted to see this legislation go in. In 1882, Congress passed a law that excluded, that limited, that forbade any additional Chinese people to come to the United States, right? However, although Asian immigration to the United States was excluded, we already talked about how there were several decades worth of immigrants who had already come. And so the American-born children of these Asian immigrants were, because of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, were citizens of the United States and had the ability to do things like vote. Now, they often had to carry papers to prove that they were American citizens. And this is the history of, some of the first legislation going through where people had to carry a document to prove their citizenship status. But nonetheless, some children of Chinese immigrants were able to vote. So, the boundaries are redrawn by things like the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, but they're certainly not eliminated. And it wasn't just Congress, but it was also the executive branch, the judicial branch, that really also in law set back the 15th Amendment, that in particular, the courts they started to say, hey, I understand that this law says exactly this thing. So if exactly this thing is not being denied, then, they let things slide if kind of the spirit of the law was being broken. A famous case that had to do with Native Americans had to do with a man by the name of John Elk. So John Elk was a man who was born in Indian Territory in Oklahoma. He totally gave up his tribal identification. He moved to Omaha. He worked there. He paid taxes. And then he tried to claim citizenship and tried to register to vote and was completely denied this right. So the courts, in many ways, are denying to really back up what the 15th Amendment had said. So you've got the states, the executive branch isn't interested in helping, the judicial branch isn't interested in helping, and then on top of these de jure backlash, there's also a bunch of extra legal means in which people's voting rights are abrogated. And so, this has to do with the growth of terrorist organizations in the United States. The most prominent of the white nationalist organizations was the KKK. And this group really had one goal. The goal of this group and others like it was to harass, to intimidate, and to kill anyone who sought to exercise their newly found rights. So, even if you got past the poll tax, or if you got past the literacy test, if you actually tried to vote, someone might show up at your house, they might burn your house down, and they might kill you as well. And so you can imagine that the effect that this had, that very, very quickly, this legal watershed that the 15th Amendment had created was its effects were diminished, its effects were dampened. So it had clearly said that citizens had the right to vote irrespective of their color, their race, their condition of previous servitude. And it was a second founding in a lot of ways. It was a legal watershed. These amendments, they fundamentally changed the relationship that the individual had to the national state. It gave the individual a direct relationship to the federal government. And as we discussed, that wasn't something that was there in the original Constitution and Bill of Rights. It was now the job of the federal government to protect the individual rights of citizens. And as we have talked about, we have a good 10 years of meaningful participation where citizens did exercise these rights, where they did participate in the political process. But those accomplishments, that second founding, also led to an extreme backlash, a violent backlash, a backlash that some historians have called like the nadir of racism in the United States, like the low point, like when racism got worse than at any other time, and when racial segregation and large-scale disenfranchisement of people of color in the United States became completely re-entrenched. All right. So let's go back to kind of the entire reason that we were thinking about this topic to begin with. And let's think about like, what are some of our takeaways? What are maybe some things that we have learned after studying the history of voting rights that we can take away from this presentation? I'm going to offer two, but I think it's good for you to think on your own of what do you think the significance of this story is? What do you think the meaning or the moral of this story is? The first one that I'm going to put up is the nature of change. All right. People like Frederick Douglass, they wanted to change society. In a lot of ways, they were very effective. They got 3 constitutional amendments passed, and there was a very small window of time in which those things could have happened. But if you look at the way that change happens, constitutional amendments, they're not self-reinforcing, right? They don't like enforce themselves. Just because the Constitution says something, that doesn't mean that things are automatically going to culminate in like universal acquiescence, right? I mean, if people have hate in their hearts to do harm against you, in some ways it doesn't matter what the law says, right? So the years that followed Reconstruction, we saw the state courts, the federal courts, and even the Supreme Court choose to look the other way of what the Constitution and the amendments said. And, you know, by the end of Reconstruction and the end of the 19th century, the vast majority of people of color in the United States had lost the right to vote, right? That people were not able to exercise these rights, that slavery was dead, but the commitment to white supremacy was still there, right? So I think the first thing that we have to learn about the nature of change is that progress is not a straight line, right? And, you know, I guess that builds in some ways against the second thing that I wanted to say is about the nature of change makers. You know, if you think about the man who Frederick Douglass was for a second, you know, he was a man who devoted himself and his life, not just to seeing the end of slavery in the United States, but to seeing that members of the Black community and other groups of marginalized people enjoyed full citizenship rights. And when we looked at the dates of his life, he died before this ever happened, right? He died at the end of the 19th century. He died at what we said was the nadir of racism in the United States. So because progress is not a straight line, and because the 15th Amendment had been effectively nullified by the time he died in the 19th century, we could say that it takes a pretty stubborn courageousness, a pretty fierce tenacity to fight for what you believe in for the majority of your life, even when you're not seeing progress. So I think that's a second takeaway, that it would not be for another 100 years with the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that Douglass's dream was in any way realized, right? But those actions of that later civil rights generation, those people who are often called the second Reconstruction, they would not have been able to exist if people like Douglass hadn't stood up when that small window of opportunity arose in the years after the Civil War to get those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments through. Okay, so if you're interested in learning about this topic, you know, I have a few books that I put on the screen, that, you know, books that I use to help prepare for this talk. But I thought that we could end our discussion and our thought about voting rights in United States history. I thought we could give the last word to Frederick Douglass. Often when we think about our nation's first founding, when we think about the Declaration of Independence, when we think about the Constitution, we think of the words of Thomas Jefferson. And the words of Thomas Jefferson often inspire many people today. And, you know, as many of you can probably remember, he said, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so we often cite men like Thomas Jefferson in thinking about some of the ideals that started the American Revolution. And so I'd like to do the same thing with our second founding. And I want to leave us with a quote from Frederick Douglass, and again from this Composite Nation speech. When in the 19th century, when there were many people in the United States who said that multiple groups of people, be they African Americans, Native Americans, women of any race, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, there were many people who wanted to see that others' rights were not recognized. And in his speech, Douglass says this, he says, "There are things in this world such as human rights. They rest upon no conventional foundation, but are external, universal, and indestructible." So I'll leave you there with Frederick Douglass's words, and I will thank you for listening to this presentation today. It was graciously supported with an educator enhancement grant from Ohio Humanities, and their goal is to encourage all Ohioans to explore the human story. Thank you for listening.